right, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be speaking here at iMAL. So thank you for this invitation. I'm very interested in the activities of this center, and I would actually like to start by paying an homage of your recent activities, which is this great exhibition, Welcome to the Future, the floppy CD-ROM revolution, to which my lecture, I think in one way or another, is also connected. So my, as you just heard, so my work, I think, is mostly linked with this emerging field of media archaeology that I've been trying to, from my side, develop maybe for about 25 years. But I have been also involved in many other things on the side, so not everything is media archaeology in life, and, you know, thank God. So when I first encountered CD-ROM as a possibility for digital arts, it was not about media archaeology, about the past, but it was really about the future for me as well. So I actually was very closely connected with this field in the 1990s as it was happening. This means I organized several exhibitions in different countries dedicated to that sort of like CD-ROM art. I was also a jury member for the event which is called MILIA, which was a interactive multimedia market, which the Reed Midem organization started at Cannes, thought that it would be the counterpart, digital counterpart for the Cannes Film Festival and such cases. So there'll be a few references to those ideas in what will follow. But so if you have an idea about media archaeology, you also know that media archaeology is often about context. It is about continuities and discontinuities, basically putting things into bigger pictures to make structures become visible, structures that often have been hidden for various reasons as the time flies and media culture keeps on evolving. This is why I am beginning from a very unpopular thinker these days, especially in Ukraine, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and his famous question, what is to be done? But I'm actually looking at it in a slightly different context. And to get to this context, I'm taking first a little bit of a sort of like media archaeological route. And instead of CD-ROM, I'm going to look at another kind of a disk that could be qualified as a data disk. This data disk anticipated CD-ROM, I would say, for over half a century. And it is an interesting point of comparison because the spirograph picture disk from the early 20th century ended up being a miserable failure. And I think that to a certain extent we can say the same about the CD-ROM. You will see a little bit later in my presentation a few stories about people with really high hopes, and then high hopes crushed miserably. So we need to understand why that crash happened and why these people sort of like had to go through that terrible disappointment that I think in many cases affected their whole future careers. So let's have a little peek at this even more forgotten media archaeological object called the spirograph. Theodore Brown, posing with the device that he imagined around 1907, which finally in the 1920s reached a stage at which it could be turned into a commercial product. Theodore Brown had come around 1905 to an interesting discovery. He found out that he was able to take film frames, so standard film frames, and reduced them to the microscopic scale. This is a disc which is thought to be the first microscopic kinematograph pictures taken by Theodore Brown, December 4, 1905. So the picture frames in this circle that you see around this tiny disc were about 1/50th of an inch if you measure horizontally. He spoke about microdot moving picture discs. And Theodore Brown started thinking that this is a potential revolution in the field of the visual culture, especially culture of the moving images. Now, he was not basing his ideas on nothing. There was already a long tradition of so-called data discs. So this means discs which when spun, will produce an illusion of vision, sometimes including letters and other kinds of things, including something that originated here in Belgium, which is the phenakistoscope or the phantascope. This is actually one of my great treasures from my private collection. This is the only known complete copy of what should be here in Belgium, but is in my collection in Los Angeles. The only complete Joseph Plateau set published in Brussels in 1833-1834. So there was a long tradition of many names, many inventions, and many of these Theodore Brown knew when he started thinking about microscopic moving picture discs. But he was also thinking about other kinds of spinning discs, discs that produced sounds, which was at the time becoming, it was still new, but becoming familiar in many places. So this ended up through a very, very complicated story that is going to be told in my new MIT Press book into a device called the spirograph. So spirograph was marketed to the audience as a moving picture machine for every man's home. So device that would change everything. Even kids could use it to project pictures from those spinning discs with movies in microscopic spiral form. It was actually supposed to be the modern panacea, so something that solves all the problems of motion pictures outside of theaters. Low-priced, safe, and easy to operate. The probabilities are that every schoolroom in the world will have one, that most homes will have one, that every business establishment, every single business establishment will have anywhere from 1 to thousands. There is not a single field of commercial pursuit where the spirograph does not fit in. It promises to be as much of a necessity as is the telephone. It will be on the market in about 1 year, maybe less. Production plans are being rushed. So it was a device that could be used for many purposes, a fascinating way to study, used in direct mode of viewing, scanning those discs back and forth and even stopping on single frames. It could be used as the silent salesman, showing industrial processes shown in offices, and it could be taken to the fields to sell tractors to farmers whom you can never drag from their fields back to their home. So the salesman will go to the fields with the spirograph. It was portable, it was sealed in a handy box, and it was actually battery-operated device, probably the first of its kind in the world. There was to be something called the Living Book of Knowledge, a huge library of spirograph records. They could be rented or they could be bought $1 each, almost like Apple has been charging for songs on iTunes. There was a huge industrial organization created by Charles Urban around this device. So you see spirograph mentioned as part of this system, which included other products, including color Kinemacolor, so color film projectors, and then all kinds of software-based services like Film Science Library, other such things. So the plans were huge, and everything came to nothing in 1923. So why did such an ambitious, decades-long revolutionary device fail? One reason was the delayed launch. So these records could only show movies of 1.5 minutes, which would have been acceptable in 1908, but it was no longer acceptable in 1923 when feature film had made its breakthrough. They started to say that this thing has huge advantages when the whole big, let's say, documentary film is chopped up into a series of discs with records with 1.5 minutes, because you don't have to watch the whole thing. You only select the things that matter, and you watch those scenes. And you can watch them interactively. But this idea did not really convince everybody. The technology was fragile and problematic because obviously parts broke down easily. Device was too unfamiliar. Moving pictures were associated with linear celluloid film, not with spinning records. Although the format may have been partly chosen because of the familiar sound records, which will help persuade people to go for the familiar thing rather than something utterly unknown and strange. The idea of an individual interactive device as a terminal to a visual library may have been too far ahead, so something people couldn't imagine, really. But in the end, so there were the economic problems. So the cash crisis that bankrupted the company, 2 huge investments, and the issue of manufacturing and marketing both hardware and software, which proved to be too costly. And this is an interesting reference because there have been many people who over the years have thought that Apple will collapse because Steve Jobs decided to stick both to hardware manufacturing and software manufacturing. It hasn't, but it certainly happened to Spirograph. So let's jump ahead half a century, and we find this moment, 1982, when Sony and Philips came up with a new solution for sounds, asking even this question since October 1, 1982, when these other kinds of discs were made public, is this a record? So what is needed is basically what we call a media archaeology of the data disk, one that doesn't only start with these digital devices, but actually goes back much, much further, like I just very simply sketched in this beginning. And I think that we need to ask a couple of important questions. So when we think about digital formats like CDs, CDIs, DVDs, also hard disks and floppies would have spinning disks inside those cases, even though we don't normally see them in operation. Do all these disk formats belong to the same cultural series as the Spirograph, or are they unrelated? Is looking for links and parallels between analog and digital forms superfluous? And obviously we could say that there is a significant difference. Even though almost all the Spirograph machines have disappeared without a trace, there are only 8 known in the world. I have the best in my collection that works. Sorry to be so, collectors are difficult people. So, I do have functioning records with those picture records in microscopic using microscopic process. But it's very difficult to make copies or preserve those because you have to copy them in spiral from frame by frame. So this is what in the United States the George Eastman House has actually done for 2 discs. And but there's the point that if I want to look at them with a magnifying glass, I can figure out what's on that picture record anyway. But I cannot obviously do the same for laser discs or the CD-ROMs. There is a chronology that I don't have time to go through, and that's probably familiar with you. But if we think about this transition, it happens from about 1972 when Philips introduces a prototype for recording and playback of sounds with laser, to about 1996, 1997, when this CD-ROM, so-called CD revolution, starts showing clear signs of failure, even catastrophe. And in between we have a series of dates that have to do with different kind of disk formats, including in 1984, again Philips and Sony introducing compact disc read-only memory, so CD-ROM. And as you can see from this list, which is an obvious fact, is that this development, especially the later half of it, takes place simultaneously as something important happens in network communication. So famously, Tim Berners-Lee introduces World Wide Web in 1989, and then the first NSCA Mosaic browser for the internet introduced on the January 23, 1993. And I forgot to mention the MILIA, 1994, the first yearly international publishing and new media market organized by Read Midem, the trade fair organization in Cannes, France. In the 1980s, there doesn't seem to have that much buzz around CD-ROM actually. So there was much buzz about CDs. You find many ads for sound CDs and the CD technology in the publications of the time, but much less about CD-ROM in the first years after 1984. Mostly when you do, you find it as an accessory for your personal computer in the sense of creating CDs on your PCs, not so much as a publishing medium. So it takes a number of years, and I think that there are certain technological thresholds, and there's also this novelty factor that have to be, in a way, worked out before we end up with something like this. This is a set of CDs that I got with my first generation Macintosh laptop computer that was the PowerBook 170, I think, with which I traveled around the world in the beginning of the 90s, which was a lousy machine in many, many ways, but it was with a CD drive. And so that machine is gone long time ago, but I still keep the discs that came with it. And this already included the one that I had some software to be played with that Macintosh computer. So we see that this is actually a stage towards turning the CD-ROM into this publishing medium that we then encounter with, of course, famous titles like the Miller Brothers and Brøderbunds Mist, which is seen here near the top of the list of 15 so-called best-selling, but actually selling very small numbers of CD-ROMs, I think in 1994 in this case. And we find then the whole new part of publishing a press, not so much actually on the online, because that possibility was just going to appear, but a new series of magazines that have been almost completely disappeared these days, but which from my point of view are very much the whole archaeology of these CD-ROMs. I'm going to make this proposition in the end that these efforts to restore, preserve, never should be just based on CD-ROM disks, but it should be on everything that's surrounded it. As everybody already knows, and I think that especially after that wonderful event that took place here, so we actually very rapidly then, starting about 1992, start seeing the appearance of a tradition of very varied and in their own way interesting publications, and many of the good ones that worked for the Macintosh rather than the PCs. I would have plenty to say about this, but I don't think I have time why this is the case. And we see a lot of variety. I've just collected from my shelf, my private personal collection from the time, a couple of interesting titles that comes from that moment. And I tried to sort of like emphasize kind of a variety in this case. Another aspect that we find, for example, from this interactive movie called The Daedalus Encounter is the idea of packaging design. And so I'm a professor at the Design Media Arts department. So in my way of thinking, once again, as important as this emulator culture that we talked about is, and as much as we have to push that boundary, it doesn't solve the other problem, is that when you come to ambitious products with the CD-ROM platform, so some of the packaging design was very much part of that whole total experience and the system of expectations. And that packaging design culture is the one that has been completely lost. I actually do keep quite a large collection of CD-ROMs in their original packaging. I never threw away anything. So all my CD-ROMs are absolutely in this amazing way how this Daedalus Encounter package was opening. One of the most ridiculous looking CD-ROMs from the time is this 2 Market, which was an interactive shopping mall on CD-ROMs. So it is supposed to be a monthly sort of like service where you would get these discs with ever new selections of consumer items. And then instead of going online, because that opportunity did not exist, you would be calling a toll-free number that's mentioned on the CD-ROM. You make your selections on the CD-ROM and then you call a telephone number and make your orders. It is nothing that really worked that well. Anyway, there were very ambitious ideas, and one of the ambitious people was the Mark Cantor, who was the founder of the originally, I think, Macromedia Corporation. So many of you may have used the Macromedia Director. So Mark Cantor tried to recruit the CD-ROM as a carrier for ambitious multimedia performances on this form. He brought in a lot of people from the world of visual music and video art and formed something he called the media band. Now I'm quoting what Mark Cantor said at the MILIA 95. I was present there, I was in the jury. And so this I published in an article called The Art on the CD-ROM Frontier in 1995. So Mark Cantor in a panel said, well, there's no basic difference between the CD-ROM and the earlier computer diskettes. Did anyone ever speak about diskette culture? He remarked. The whole idea of CD-ROM culture is equally absurd. So he urged artists to create multimedia artworks that are too big for the CD-ROM platform. For him, the CD-ROM was only good for making fragments of the work in progress known every now and then, heading towards the big thing. So Cantor's audiovisual fireworks are really meant to be accessible one day via the net in a kind of interactive turbo version of the music television. This was an interesting point because actually it basically pointed out many of these problems and issues that were becoming apparent at that point. And now the Mosaic browser and soon to be followed Netscape was already making some headway and asking questions that were not asked 2 or 3 years before about that medium and its future. What we saw happening at that point was also this sort of like coming of interesting hybrid products, including the something called the Interactive World Sphere, which was basically combined online and CD-ROM based application. So this means that the heavy things hard to calculate were placed on a CD-ROM that had a way of linking it to the internet. And so things that would be changing rapidly and quickly came from the online component. So this was an attempted solution to obvious technical bottlenecks at that time, but it hardly took off very sort of like radically. But certainly for these purposes of preservation in our time, this is another of those problematic issues. How do you basically preserve a medium that was not one or the other, but both at the same time, when those network capabilities have many times over changed from the ones that you had in these early days of the World Wide Web? Now, there are fates. I'm not a fatalist, but I have encountered many sad stories of people with high hopes being crushed. One of them was Nobuhiro Shibayama, who produced one of the most, I would say, remarkable CD-ROMs of the time, which was called the Biomorph Encyclopedia Muybridge. This disc was connected with a long series of artistic interpretations of Edward Muybridge's chronophotographic work. These days it's mostly accessible on the YouTube by this really, really low resolution video that the artist himself in 2001 put up there. So this is an interesting work, so where the Muybridge's chronophotographic sequences have been digitized and turned into this kind of a sort of like anamorphically distorting series, reflecting on ideas, so the transition from analog visual culture to the digital, and then putting it into this kind of a experimental frame. Very little I ever heard about Shibayama since that time, when he did this one and the only known kind of masterful CD-ROM. Another such figure would be Greg Roach, who was actually promoting himself, and maybe some others were promoting him as the first superstar of CD-ROM, as a kind of a filmmaker who would make the transition to the new medium. One of his most noted pieces was called The Madness of Roland, which was a sort of like medieval fantasy adventure in the form of a kind of a digital book. So which had already a relatively huge production staff and actors in video sequences embedded within that sort of like world. So this was relatively heavily advertised in the print media at that time. And what is interesting is that these days one possibility to see what it was all about is to go to oldgames.com and actually download the full Madness of Roland, which is only 162 megabytes. So you can experience this a very strange mix of book, play and game right there. Greg is one of those people who sort of like went high for a quick moment and then down, never to be really heard again. And this is from an undated website which shows how Greg Roach currently explores the convergence of spirituality, travel and mobile media, while also being the gunslinger on Red Steel 2 for Ubisoft in Paris. So a relatively anonymous position somewhere in the industry after that big promise. So Radical TV was a very important cult, techno pop act in the 1980s in Japan. And Haruhiko Shono, whom you saw performing here, actually took the leap to the world of CD-ROM publishing, producing Alice 1991, and then a kind of cult hit called L-Zone, kind of futuristic trip to a strange underground world. Something that you can mostly, again, access these days through videos like the KAL's play acts that they post on the YouTube, which is so like two guys commenting on that experience of playing through forgotten CD-ROM titles. Actually, I found it as attracting very few views, actually, as you see from here. So Haruhiko Shono made a radical change from being a sort of like media art, pop, techno act, stage performer to being a multimedia creator, and imagined to find a new career. He created one of the still the best known CD-ROM titles called Gadget in 1993. And he was for many years rumored to work on something much bigger called the Underworld. I met Shono a few times in Japan in those years, and I asked him about the Underworld, and he said, well, it's coming, it's a big thing, and then everything collapsed. Underworld never appeared. His company called Synergy went bankrupt, and we thought for many years that the poor Mr., whose name I don't remember right now, who was the founder of Synergy, had committed suicide. We found him many years later, but he was so ashamed and so totally sort of like depressed of the collapse of his ambitious thing, just as he had signed with David Lynch, a contract for David Lynch to do the next CD-ROM adventure for his company, that he just disappeared. And so did Mr. Shono. So very high hopes crashed, and Shono never really returned. Until 2001, it was announced that Gadget was now iGadget for iPhones and iPads. So maybe there would be an opportunity here for some other of those cult titles that were noticed and then completely lost and disappeared. So I'm coming to the end now, so I'm a little bit over time. So what went wrong? Can we say that everything went wrong? Now, first, CD-ROM storage and data retrieval capability was clearly too slow and too low, especially for fast applications like games and interactive films. This was often pointed out already at that time. There were many confusions between systems. Is it for PC? Is it on Mac? Is it for CDI, CDTV or so? And the disks were very difficult to install and run, I can tell you, because I worked for the MILIA jury. And how many hours did I struggle with play any of the PC-based CD-ROMs? Potential user base with multimedia-capable computers was low, too low at the time. Also, there was a loss in transition. The CD-ROM wave was simultaneous with the introduction of the World Wide Web and the Mosaic. Hybrid forms proved unsatisfactory. Discontents of handling physical disks is an issue, and this is a very interesting sort of like anthropological question. So, and which may have something to do with now the fact that the younger generation has abundant DVDs for online communications. And then there were distribution problems, where to buy, how to deliver, for whom. There are also things like magazines, which were on CD-ROMs, and this is a question, is it worth the preservation effort? Some of them have really elaborate packaging like this unzip, which in itself is an important object, I think, for cultural reconsideration. Finally, questions about preservation and resurrection. There are many interesting titles that never found a publisher, such as feminist works by V&S Matrix, Linda Demant, and Susan Metros. So what should we do with them? Is an emulator version sufficient? What about the role of packaging, which is often elaborate and integral part of the work? Tracing the creators like Jim Ludke, Greg Roach, and Haruki Hosono would be important. Then we have this very big question, which is, are all projects worth preserving? Media archaeology says yes, but should we be reasonable? We obviously cannot do that. But who will make the selections of what's important and what's not? Media archaeologists want to look at it from the other side rather than from sort of like evaluation superimposed on something done in the past from the present. And also the idea that we should not resurrect only the CD-ROMs, but also the culture around them, including the discourses in dedicated general magazines and newspapers on the internet and in professional and user circles. And much of this is obviously disappearing or at least very hard to trace. So to finally, just to show you, let's say these two remarkable cyber-feminist CD-ROMs, Cyberflesh Girl Monster by Linda Demant and the All New Gen by V&S Matrix, definitely would deserve to be brought back. And the same about Susan Metros's really fine work, Good Daughter, Bad Daughter, Good Mother, Bad Daughter. And with this, I'm coming to an end of my presentation. So hopefully there were some things to think about in this thing. So thank you very much.